Hello and welcome to The Living Legends. My name is Fayaz Qureshi. In this edition of The Living Legends, we speak to a man who has been a barrister for the last 60 years. Over this period, he's been a defense attorney, a deputy public prosecutor, worked in the Iran-USA Claims Tribunal in the Netherlands, and chaired the Judges and Magistrates Vetting Board. Besides that, he has served in the Court of Arbitration for Sport. Our guest on The Living Legends is Sharad Rao. Sharad Rao, it's great to have you on The Living Legends. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to the program which you call Living Legends.
Yes, we consider you a legend and you're here.
But let me say in all humility, I do not claim myself to be a legend.
Oh, you've had a great prolific career. So let's start off with your early life and education in Kenya.
Well, I was born in Kenya and I went to school here. And in those days, we were under British colonial rule. And as you know, Kenya was racially divided. So all the schools, the hospitals, clubs, various facilities were divided on a racial basis.
Right.
So the schools that I went to was a school that was reserved for Indians. There was a different school for Europeans and a different school for Africans. So I went to what was called at that time the Government Indian Primary School, which eventually became Government Indian High School.
Okay.
Eventually the Duke of Gloucester School when I left.
Which is Jamhuri High today.
What is today the Jamhuri High.
I'm from Jamhuri, my brothers, we're all from Jamhuri High. Great. And thereafter?
Thereafter I sort of did senior Cambridge at Duke of Gloucester. I could not proceed further because of financial problems. So I didn't do my A-level and I went out to work. So I looked for employment. And I got a job with Kenya Shell. And I served in Kenya Shell from 1953 right up to 1956 to be able to earn some money to enable me to go to England. So
how did you pick law as a career?
I think I had no option. So when I joined Shell, I had no idea what I was going to do. They took me on, and then my boss, who was an Indian, he told me that I was wasting my time in Shell and I should really pursue further studies.
Right.
So and he suggested to me that I should take up law. And I told him that I didn't have the required qualifications and that I didn't have the minimum A-level, nor a university degree, nor what they required, which was compulsory to have Latin as a subject.
Okay.
However, I applied, and to my surprise, I was admitted, despite only having done O-level and despite not having the
Wow, that's interesting.
Latin.
That was a real stroke of luck.
But I think also my performance at Cambridge was very good. I think I stood first in the entire Cambridge examination, and that's probably got
And then you went to the UK.
That's when I went to the UK.
And you came back?
Yeah, I went in 1956.
Yeah.
I completed my law within 3 years because of financial problems. I could not waste time. So I took the first available examination, passed it, fortunately, and I came back.
Which university you qualified?
At Lincoln's Inn. Just Lincoln's Inn, and,
wow.
And their own exams, which they call the Council of Legal Education. So I came back in 1959. 1959, June, I was called to the bar. Just about 2 weeks later, I came back to Nairobi.
So what was the legal scene here in Kenya on the onset of independence?
We were not independent yet in 1959.
Right.
Yeah. And
yes, from 59 to 63 and then thereafter.
Thereafter. So in 59 when I came, I had to do pupillage for 1 year. And all the major law firms were European. And it was their stated policy that they would not take an Indian or an African, not even as a pupil. I applied to all wrote back to say, sorry, as an Indian we cannot accept you because it is restricted only to Europeans. So I applied to the State Law Office, what used to be called the Crown Law Office at the time. And I was called for an interview to see the Attorney General. I had a small little Fiat. I went there to what is now still the Sharia House. I saw a parking which was empty and I parked my car there. And as I still had time before the interview, about half an hour or so I went to a nearby coffee place. When I came back from coffee, I found that my car was surrounded by police. There were quite a few people there. And when I went there, they said, why did I park my car there? So I said, why shouldn't I? I saw a parking place and I parked my car. I said, no, that is reserved for the Attorney General.
Okay.
And a European chap came out and he started really shouting at me, screaming. So I couldn't take it. So I said to him, you say it is reserved for the Attorney General. I could not read it. It doesn't say so, because I didn't park it intentionally, knowing that it was reserved for the Attorney General. Well, why are you screaming like that? Who are you anyway? So he said, I am the Attorney General. So I got into my car. I left. I didn't turn up for the interview.
Can you imagine? Okay.
So after that, I was able somehow to get pupillage with an Irish lawyer called O'Byrne, who used to be a Crown Counsel. And he was the leading prosecutor in the state law office, the Crown Law Office.
Okay.
And he had just started private practice, so he took me on condition that I would share the room with his law clerk, who was an Indian called Mr. Khan. So I agreed. And I started my career there, first as a pupil, and I used to accompany him in all the criminal cases that he was doing.
Right.
So then I developed this inkling to only do criminal cases rather than civil cases. That's how I was trained. And in the 60s, I don't know whether you will remember, but there was an agitation for freedom. There was a freedom movement.
Right.
And a lot of freedom fighters were being charged and taken to court.
Right.
There were two political leaders at the time. One was Tom Mboya, and the other was Jaramogi Odinga. Tom Mboya, I knew him also socially. And Tom would come to me with anyone who was charged with any of those offenses. He would come to me, and I would act almost pro bono. Whenever he had money, he would come and put it on my table. But I'd never asked, I never expected any money, and I appeared in quite a few cases which concerned the our Kenya freedom movement. So that's how I got my name in the newspapers, my photograph in the newspapers, and I started making a name as a criminal lawyer.
I see. And an interesting aspect which we discussed before the interview, you used to present the news on KBC radio and TV in the 60s.
60s when I came, as I said, when I started, I did a pupillage.
Rather, Voice of Kenya.
Yeah.
At that point in time.
I started as a pupil, then I went into practice. And practice, as I said, most of it was pro bono.
Right.
So I needed some money somewhere. And I was asked
Any extra buck could help.
Yes. So I read news on the Voice of Kenya. I started off with the English version, which used to be at 7 o'clock in the morning, and I used to come back at 7 o'clock in the evening. And eventually they asked me also to read on TV. So I did that for several years at a very small kind of allowance that I was paid, but it was quite a lot of money for me.
Interesting aspect we didn't know. Welcome back home.
Thank you.
Now, you could tell us some of your experiences in the courtroom as a defense attorney.
I think the most famous case that I did as a defense attorney was a murder case in which an Indian called Pyarelal Basan had been charged for murder. He was charged for murder for having killed, or having allegedly killed, his wife and children. He had arranged an ambush on the airstrip going to Neri airport. And all of them were killed except a small little child who was left alive.
Oh my God, horrific.
And all that he had, he said that he had run away from them and was hiding in the bush. And all that he had is some minor cuts on his body. So I defended him. And there was a public outcry at the time. The Indians marched to State House, which was government house at the time. Evelyn Baring was the governor. They demanded protection. They demanded that this case be investigated. So Baring put one of his top investigating officers to investigate the case, a chap called Superintendent Baker. And I was defending before a New Zealand judge called Macduff. And it was rather interesting because Macduff was a good judge, but it was very difficult in court. He could find faults with you for no reason at all. So when I first appeared and I stood up and I said to him that I represent the accused, and he said, I can't hear you. So I said, sorry. No. I was accepted as a defense counsel.
Right.
Well, then we had Superintendent Baker in the witness box, and I stood up to cross-examine him. So I asked Superintendent Baker, I said, what was the atmosphere like when you were questioning my client? I pronounced the word atmosphere with the accent on the second syllable, atmosphere. So Judge Macduff turned around to me and he said, I don't understand your question. So I repeated it. And he still said, I don't understand it. I repeated, he said, I don't understand it. So I asked Superintendent Baker, I said, do you understand my question? He said, yes, sir. I asked the prosecutor, who was the DPP at the time, Clive Brooks, and he said, yes. I asked the other defense counsel, they said, yes. So I looked at the judge and I said, my lord, everyone else in the court seems to understand the question.
Except you.
You don't seem to understand. Can you tell me why? He says, Mr. Rao, the word is atmosphere, not atmosphere, as you spell it. So I said, my lord, I thought we were doing a murder case, not an English language class. So he lost his temper, he took out his wig, threw it on the table, you will see me in chambers. So I went with Clive Brooks, and as we sat in his chambers, Clive Brooks turns around and said, Sharad, you should apologize. I said, Clive, you keep out of it. This is between me and the judge. So the judge said, quite right, Mr. Brooks, you keep out, let me deal with Mr. Rao. So he said, are you going to apologize? I said, no, my lord. I don't think I did anything wrong. And perhaps my English may not be as good as spoken by an Englishman, but it's still good. So he said, look, as a young lawyer, you must understand, you should not be cheeky. So I said, my lord, if you deal with me the way you are dealing, and I know that you're going to convict my client, so I don't want my client to feel that it was because of me that he was convicted.
Because of this small issue.
Yeah. But you want me to apologize, I will apologize. So I said, I'm sorry. So he said, all right, let's leave it at that, and we continue. All right? So the charge against him was having murdered his wife. The wife, according to the newspapers, the photographs that we had seen, was a very good-looking woman. So he did it because he had fallen in love with the nurse, was also an Indian nurse. And when she was called to give evidence, the courtroom was full, packed, because people were very keen now to know who this woman was for whom he had now fallen in love and killed his wife. So in walked a woman, short, fat, with a lot of smallpox marks on her face, so much that I told my friend, I looked at my the defense counsel, and I said, I can't look at her. I have to look elsewhere to be able to ask questions to her. Anyway, we proceeded.
This actually proves had a beautiful wife, but fell in love with someone mediocre. Love is blind.
So that evening, the Chief Justice had a party at his house, a cocktail. I went there. And this judge was there, Judge Macduff. So he came up to me and he said, Rao, if for no other reason, I'm going to convict your client for his taste in women. And I said, Judge, I will not blame you.
Interesting.
Since then, we had very interesting, very cordial relationships
as well. Now, you were hired as a state counsel and you became a deputy public prosecutor. The late Charles Jonjo was Attorney General, and he could influence a lot at the behest of the late Mzee Jomo Kenyatta. Now, what were your experiences then?
Let me first tell you how I came to join the Attorney General's office. I was practicing as an associate with Achur Kapila, a very well-known criminal lawyer, who had defended Jomo Kenyatta. I had done a few cases with him, and he was quite impressed with my handling of cases, and he had taken me on as an associate in his firm. Then there was a matter in which I defended an Indian, a Patel, who was charged with accountancy offences, fraud, embezzlement, etc. And without asking me, he had levied a very heavy fee on him. So when I looked at the file and I told him, I said, look, Mr. Kapila, it doesn't look to me that there is a defense and we have charged so much money to the client. He said, you just go to court. You see, it's not for you to argue. Just go and defend, do your best. I went, we eventually pleaded guilty, and he was sentenced to 8 years imprisonment or something. The following day, his wife and children came up to the office and said that they had no one else to live with because the husband had gone to jail. And could we give her some money so that she could travel to India by the cheapest possible means, which was by boat or deck class, what used to be called.
Right.
So I went to Kapila and asked him, and I said, look, this is it. We've charged them a lot of money. He didn't benefit. He's gone into jail for 8 years. So let's at least help this lady with the fare that she's asking for. And Kapila's answer to me was, we are not a charity. Answer is no. So I was taken completely aback. I went and I told them, I said, look, I'm sorry, but the firm is not able to assist you.
Right.
But I have some money in my pocket, which I took out and I gave it to her. And I said, I hope this helps you to some extent, and I'm so sorry I can't help you further. So in disgust, I left the chamber.
Right.
And I walked up to the Charter Hall, where the lawyers used to meet for coffee. There I found John Hobbs, who used to be the DPP at the time, with James Karugu, who was the senior state counsel in their office.
Yeah.
And so we had coffee together. Hobbs looked at me and said, Sharad, is something wrong? You don't look all right to me. So I related the story to him. And he said, what are you going to be doing next? So I said, frankly, John, I don't know. This has just happened. I've just walked out. I have to think. So he said, can we meet here tomorrow for coffee?
Right.
So the following day we met for coffee with him and Karugu. And he told me, he said, look, the state, Kenyatta, the President Kenyatta, was very keen to Africanize the position of DPP. And they have Karugu in mind, but Karugu does not have enough experience.
Right.
So what Jonjo has told me, that if you can get Rao as your assistant, as his assistant,
right,
then it could make up for his loss of experience, lack of experience. So on that basis, I joined the chambers.
I see.
All right, and I said, I will not come as a state counsel, and I will not apply for the job. You got to invite me, and you got to create a position for me. So a position was created for the first time of assistant DPP, and that's how I joined the chambers.
And your experiences with Charles Jonjo during your tenure?
And no, Charles Jonjo was not popular with very many people, but I had great respect for him. Because one, he was extremely good as far as administration was concerned.
Right.
Very punctual, very strict about protocol, very strict about ethics. And also he had helped quite a few people. Anyone who was in problem, I mean, not only for cases, but a woman would come and say, my children are held up because they don't have school fees. He would call me in and he says, Rao, can you arrange for someone to pay their school fees? If someone was in hospital and was not being released because he had not paid the hospital fees, I would be asked to collect some money and get him released. So that kind of thing he used to do a lot. Eventually we had even started a heart foundation to assist children who could not afford. We were getting people from doctors from overseas who operated on them. So that's how I started in those chambers. And when I started, of course, President Kenyatta was president. And at that time, I was assistant DPP. And when Moi became president is when I was appointed the DPP.
Right. So, what prompted your departure from the role as Deputy Public Prosecutor?
I was DPP at the time. I was DPP at the time of the August 1982 attempted coup.
Right.
I had traveled with the president to India on his first official visit to India. When we went, and Jonjo was with us on the aircraft.
Right.
But downstairs on the ground, I saw Moi speaking to Gigi Kariuki, who used to be the interior minister. And they talked for a long time. When the president boarded the plane, I could see that the relationship between him and Jonjo was not as cordial as before.
As what it used to be.
So anyway, when we came back return to Kenya after our trip to India, Muthemba had been arrested. Muthemba was charged with treason, the first ever treason case that we had.
Yes, I remember that.
Now, he was a distant relative of Jonjo. So when we came back, and he had already been charged, and Karugu was then, he was then the Attorney General, and I was the DPP.
Yeah.
So I complained to him. I said, look, he has been charged without my knowledge. After I am supposed to know as DPP, and it is for me to authorize the prosecution.
Right.
So anyway, we had misunderstanding on that score. And he wanted him to be charged for treason.
Right.
And I said, whereas it was technically treason, I did not think it was serious enough to warrant the first ever treason trial
In Kenya.
And the evidence was also not strong. So I suggested we take a plea of manslaughter or sedition or something, but not that of treason. He didn't agree. This information reached the President Moy, and he summoned the two of us to State House. And he said, what is this I hear, that the two of you cannot agree on the charges? So I told him my reason. Karugu told his reason. And he said, look, as my two top legal advisors, it's not for me to advise you as to which charge you should prefer.
Right.
But whatever charge you prefer, I want a successful prosecution. Now, can you guarantee that? So I said, President, I'm suggesting a lower charge of sedition, and I know I can get a plea of guilty. So there is no question of I can't guarantee you. He will plead guilty, he will be found guilty. So he turned around to Karugu, and Karugu said, no, as far as I'm concerned, he has to be charged with treason. And Moy turned around to him and said, if you do not succeed, as Rao thinks that the case is not strong enough. And Karugu said, President, I guarantee that we will win. And he said, what if you don't win? So then I will resign. So I said, all right, on that basis you can proceed, but I want Rao to prosecute. So I was asked to prosecute, a case which I was reluctant to prosecute. We went to court, we lost. Right. And so...
It must be quite a dilemma for you as a lawyer, when you know in terms of either a prosecutor or as a defense lawyer, when you feel that this is not right.
Yes.
It can be quite a dilemma, isn't it?
Absolutely. And this was the first and the only case that I had lost in my career.
That is the first of the two-part interview with Barrister Sharad Rao. He worked his way up to be the Deputy Public Prosecutor and quit after losing Kenya's first treason case. In the second part of this interview, he tells us about working in the Netherlands for the US-Iran Claims Tribunal, serving as chair of the Judges and Magistrates Vetting Board, plus his work in sports, in administration and judicial work. We bring this part next week. Thank you for watching. I am Fayaz Qureshi.